Maybe I could begin just by making a remark or two, and then introduce the speakers once they're here. I think that this is an interesting occasion because my view of the continued importance of teaching the humanities has a lot to do with what I take to be the neglect of interpretive skills in teaching students. We are, of course, here celebrating our devotion to content, and no one could exceed my interest in content, I hope, but at the same time, as those who have been in my seminars know, I do lay a lot of emphasis on interpretation, maybe even more on interpretation than on what we conventionally call research, because I feel that the training of the mind is certainly galvanized by exposure to significant and interesting content. But that the development of the mind also requires the power of taking a point of view toward that content and reading it closely. And I know that our colleagues will be speaking to that this afternoon. And as I was saying at lunch, my own feeling is that that the urgency of this matter is greater in those schools which are probably inclined to say, oh, if we could just drum some content into their heads, we've done just about all we can do. I think that's not necessarily a self-imposed limit that people ought to take seriously. I think that the emphasis for high-need students, perhaps even more than for self-motivated students, is necessarily and properly on developing their interpretive skills. So that's the emphasis that I myself bring to bear today, but it's now my role to get out of the way and introduce this great panel. The first speaker will be Brandon Barr, a 7th and 8th grade teacher from Chicago. I say 7th and 8th grade, but I have no doubt that he's probably taught everything from kindergarten to 12 at one time or another. He was in a seminar two summers ago with Langdon Hammer on poetry, and we've asked him to come back because of his dazzling presentation, which I unfortunately didn't hear. That was one of my few years of uninvolvement in the Institute on having taught his curriculum unit, so we look forward very much to what he has to say today. The second speaker is my colleague, Professor of History and American Studies, Mary Lou, whose many areas of expertise include topics related to urban studies, immigration, questions of assimilation within the nature and trajectory of immigration, and who has been in recent years teaching incredibly successful seminars on those subjects. The third speaker, my colleague in the English department, Joseph Roach, Sterling Professor of English and Theater Studies, who is one of the world's leading and best-known authorities on theater and performance arts, and who I believe will probably be speaking about the role of those fields in the teaching of the humanities. The fourth speaker, from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where he is the Dean of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, is Scott Casper. Also, like Mary, an American historian who took his degree in American Studies here at Yale, has written several very interesting looking, I apologize for not having read them, books on American cultural and intellectual history, as well as editing other books, and is now, though I think here primarily in his administrative capacity as a person interested in our program and what its possible relevance to UMBC might be. And our last speaker is at at present the president of the Council of Independent Colleges, and you can look in your directory for a description of that. It's an extraordinarily important organization, which I think represents many of you visiting here within its constituency. Richard has long known our program because he was the director of the education division in the NEH division in the NEH when we began, and was instrumental in helping us with advice, with funding, and in many other ways in the early going of the program. And he is, we are very grateful to him for his devotion to the Teachers Institute and the initiative over the years, and we're honored to have him present here. He has, it's also interesting, by the way, speaking of the NEH, those of you who have looked at our periodical, got a certain vested interest in it because I edited it. Those of you who have looked at our periodical will see an interesting article by the current head of the NEH, William Adams. And so we are grateful for the longstanding interest of the NEH in our program. And I should say also that in the interim, Richard has been in the Mellon Foundation and in general a very important figure in American higher and public education. So I will get out of the way, and our first speaker will be Brandon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to share an anecdote with you today that helps to frame my thinking of what humanities education should be. This excerpt is from a letter that a principal used to share with his teachers at the start of every school year. I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness: gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and babies shot by high school and college graduates. So I am suspicious of education. My request is this: help your children become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, or educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human. Now, some of my colleagues are going to make some very compelling arguments about the purpose of a humanities education. They're going to say things like context-based close textual analysis, the importance of analyzing primary source documents, and I agree. That's a very important element of our instruction as teachers. But I would argue and add to that as an addition that we should have a lens that frames that work, and that lens is to make our students better humans. I think the most pressing goal of a humanities education is to develop well-rounded and civic-minded, compassionate individuals. Students need to be skilled enough to participate in the larger American dialogue. They need those skills, and the things that my colleagues are going to talk about will inculcate those skills in students. But what I really think is important is that instruction needs to be geared so that students recognize their own voice, experiences, and that their choices matter. In order to be an effective teacher, I realize that I have to craft my instruction so that students can express their voice, share their experiences, and make choices. So last year, I got to teach the unit that I developed. My unit was a product of being in the seminar Playing with Poetry. And students had the choice to use different poetic frames that I selected carefully, that I thought students would respond to craft their own poetry. I didn't say you had to do this or that. I just said, here's what one poet's done. Use that as a model to make your own poetry. Students had choice. They were able to share experiences. They were able to voice things that were important to them. And it was successful. It got students to think about their own lives. And at the start of a school year, that's actually very important for teachers to learn about their students. Their work that they produced was fantastic, and it set the stage for much larger and bigger projects that I completed with them last year. Because I had the trust of my students, I was able to do this other project, and it was actually inspired by some of the other participants in Y&I. They said, Brandon, you've got to go to the art museum. Okay, I'll go to the art museum. And it really was fantastic. And they walked through, and a couple art teachers, they took me by the hand, and they said, well, this is significant because, and this is significant because, and we learned from Timothy that. So I ended up actually from my poetry unit doing another unit where kids met with a Holocaust survivor who's also an artist in my community, and they created art pieces, and we did, it was actually kind of funny. I asked the head librarian at our local library, would you mind if I borrowed the library for a day? Like it's, something I could check out, right? She said, sure, I'm planning on having this Holocaust survivor. My students want to hear from her and make it like a community night. She didn't know what she was signing up for. So I just told the kids, go in there, start moving furniture around. We're going to keep doing it until she says no. And fortunately, the head librarian never said anything. It worked out really well. But that project wouldn't have been possible had I not taught my unit beforehand. I knew I had the kids when this one girl, she said, if we're going to do this, we got to do this all together. And she turned and she looked at her classmates. She said, all of you better be here. And when you have student engagement that's that deep, that's transformative. And it came from the unit that I taught my students. So participating in Y&I for me was a shot in the arm. I was having a difficult year before that. It gave me what I needed to continue. It was the time and space that I needed to reflect on my practice and focus on what was important for me and for my students. There are many goals for humanities education in urban schools, but I think the most pressing need is teaching humanity, empathy, courage, while still addressing all the academic domains that need to be addressed. Thank you.
So thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. It's been really a wonderful experience to be part of the local New Haven Institute and then the Yale National Initiative for the last few years. And I've learned so much from all the teachers that I've been very fortunate and honored to work with. So a lot of the thoughts that I'm about to share really come from these 3 years of working with different groups of teachers locally and nationally. And I really do feel that my teaching as a university level instructor really became better as a result of really listening to the thoughtful ways in which teachers talked about how they approach their students, how they're gauging whether their students are learning or interested. So it was very, very important to have that kind of feedback from my teachers. So I think my points connect nicely, I hope, with Brandon's in terms of thinking about what is the role of the humanities, what is the role of a historian, in terms of this approach to high-need schools. So I really do have two main points to share, and my first one simply is that I believe Our job is to teach students to be, or rather, maybe not teach, but just continue to nurture their curiosity. And hopefully we get them when they haven't lost their curiosity. And that it's really about somehow finding that spark, finding that connection to the subject for each of them. And then once we have that, is to teach them how to then ask critical questions, how to frame those questions, ask them, and then go after the answers. And that's where the skills really are. So I think the ways I've thought about this and the ways I've developed the seminars is to do a combination of heavy focus on primary sources and a wide range of sources. So more than just what typical historians might look at in terms of textual or archival documents, whether it's letters or census records or things of that sort. Those are all really fun to delve in. There's a wide range of materials we could be using and introducing into the classroom, from the built environment, for example, a walk through the neighborhood, looking at buildings and asking why are some buildings where they are, and why is the particular geography of your city the way it is, where you suddenly notice there's a quote-unquote black section of town or a Chinese section of town, a white section of town. Why might that be? And start to ask those kinds of questions. Or maybe having them look into doing oral histories where they're having conversations with people who are older than them, 2 or 3 generations older, who may have really interesting stories that they are not at all aware of, or maybe they've heard some, but to engage and delve more deeply. So to have those kinds of connections and to bring in those kinds of materials that hopefully will get them to think about their place in the world. I say this because oftentimes I hear from teachers this problem of students feeling very disengaged because of the textbooks that they might be using. They may be very wonderful in terms of imparting a national history or maybe even a regional or state history, but coming from where the students may be, from a certain socioeconomic background or a certain part of the city, they may feel very disengaged from what they're learning. And instead, I think this is where local history and primary sources are incredibly useful for getting students to think about why are things the way they are, and to really interrogate that further and not just accept that there's always been a poor section of the city, that there's always been schools that may be less funded while other schools are more funded, but to think about where were those decisions made and how they can learn then to use those skills of inquiry to then maybe fashion their own position, their own voice, to empower them as historians, as thinkers who have something to say, who have something that they can contribute to the process. So I just wanted to pause for 1 second and acknowledge an example. So this is a completely different example of this, but I couldn't help but want to bring this in. So I don't know how many of you noticed the exhibit you walked through just now. How many of you noticed? Okay, so not good people. You need to be more observant about your surroundings. But that exhibit is on the history of Japanese American internment, based on materials gathered out of Sterling Memorial Library, which is where you're sitting in now, and the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, which is across the street, the sort of beautiful white marble structure that's now under renovation. So the reason I bring that up, because that exhibit really grew out of a long history of the efforts of graduate students of mine to look at how Yale, out here in New Haven, somehow was connected to the history of Japanese American internment out on the West Coast. That is, we somehow noticed that Yale had this odd assortment of internment materials, and Yale probably has the largest collection, largest private collection, I should say, of internment materials on the East Coast. And it's almost as large as some of the West Coast collections. And so my graduate students started to really look into this, and this is the outcome of the exhibit. But to go even further back, so this work is linked to my other field, Asian American history and ethnic studies, which was always about empowering people, ordinary folks, to think about their history and ask why there may be silences and why certain aspects of history are not held in equal value and importance. So I teach here a course, Introduction to Asian American History, and the first thing I always ask my students is, how many of you have had any Asian American history in your time from wherever you happen to be? And almost always, the only hands that go up are the students from the West Coast and the students who may be from Hawaii. That's about it. So it's not that many students. Or they may say, we did encounter it, but it was the little section about the building of the West, where Chinese suddenly appear in the Transcontinental Railroad, and maybe Japanese American internment is mentioned. And then we spend time thinking about this. Why are people being written out of history? And what is our ethical responsibility as scholars, as historians, to think about reincorporating this history? How does it change our understanding of national histories as well as local histories, and to get students really more involved in that way? So that's my part one, is get them engaged, get them curious, and then get them working, and get them thinking about how to make a difference in terms of using those skills to work. And then the second part I would just say is, because of the, I think the population of students that high needs schools are working with, and these histories that we're talking about, there can be very depressing histories, quite honestly. The histories of racial exclusion, economic exploitation, people who don't get resources when they ask. So it's almost constant history of losers that can almost come when we do this kind of history. And certainly when I look at my syllabus for Asian American history, it's not until we get to about 1965 that things start to look a little better. And then it's very hard on the students to come in, day in, day out, and listen. Oh yes, and this is another anti-Chinese violence that they're, where people are lynched. Or here's another example of racial covenants, where restrictive covenants, where people can't purchase houses. So this can be really quite difficult, and I think there's also an ethical responsibility on the part of us as educators of how to create the perfect pitch for this history as well. That we are not here to make students feel demoralized and sad about their own history, but instead, again, to create critical thinkers and people who can engage with that history, and then hopefully use it as a way to move them forward in terms of how they engage with the world, so that they do care more deeply about social issues, about questions of economic or social injustice, for example, and not just sort of walk away demoralized. The other flip to that is that oftentimes my frustration as a historian is when I read some of these textbooks, they often have this kind of teleological narrative about them, where the world just seems to get better and better as we progress through. So, we had slavery, we had exclusion, but then we have World War II, and then Civil Rights Movement, and changes in Immigration Act, and it's getting better and better. But of course, the real world we live in is so much more complicated than that. And that, I think, is also what we need to teach our students, is how to think about this complexity, and not to only feel engaged if things are better, or only feel engaged if things are worse, but to be able to have nuance. And I know if anyone's from my seminar, they've heard that word way too many times, nuance. So, but I really deeply believe in that, in terms of that's how we get students to be critically engaged, and not just memorize facts. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out. Before I speak about my announced topic, I just want to express my gratitude to the whole program, but especially to the fellows who've been coming back and being in my seminars and putting up with me. I just want to say what I get out of it in a very selfish way. At the end of each summer that I've led a seminar, I'm required to produce a curriculum unit. In fact, I'm required to produce 2 for each of my courses. They stretch the semester, and I have to have my bibliography and all my plans in place. And the thing that I bring with me from the fellows is a spirit and a skill of teaching that sometimes some of us might be become detached from in a university setting. I know I have. And I want to say a few words about what they remind me of each time I've had the privilege of leading a seminar. And that is that education at its root means to draw out, not to pour into. William Butler Yeats put it this way: it's about starting a fire, not filling a pail. And there's a content in the students that, when it's drawn out, enlivens all the other things that we have to teach them. When you get that spark, when you see that they own and are invested in the material, that's when I think at any level it's safe to say a class will come alive. So thank you, my fellows. I want to start with an acronym. It's STEM, and I'm very glad to celebrate the success of STEM and even urge it on to greater heights. But I have another acronym I want to share with you. It's STEAM. Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Mathematics. What? STEAM, even better, yes. But Mary gives me the chance to rope in the humanities, which was really my intent. I was going to say I'm speaking about arts on a humanities panel, but to me they're inextricably bound, because arts are humanities with laboratories. It's a place where the students get on their feet. It's the place where, as I said before, they can take ownership in a special way of the work, because often they're not only studying the masterworks and brilliant creations that have come before, as they should, but they're also making their own and adding to it. They're not only listening for the story and hearing the story, they're able to make the story their own and retell it in their own terms. And I think this in my experience anyway, has been it's a real opportunity to have taught in the arts and humanities. It's been a real opportunity, actually, to have been completely confused about what my appointments are at any given time. Am I supposed to be at this meeting in the theater studies or in that one in English? And that is a privilege in itself, because I think that it's safe to say there's a concern about the role of the humanities today, a concern about the status of the humanities at all levels. And I read not too long ago what to me is a very comforting, indeed inspiring statistic. And that is, despite all the discussions and the quantitative measurements of the decline of the humanities in number of majors, enrollments and courses and the like, if you put arts and humanities together as fields, as I think it's a exciting thing to do when you can, if you put them together as fields in terms of numbers, there's been really no decline since 1970 in the number of students majoring and enrolled in those subjects. And I just propose here an alliance, an interdisciplinary connection, a subversive strategy of working together for the best interests of the students, because it's important for them to have science, it's important for them to have mathematics, it's important to have all of that. But as Brendan said so eloquently when we began, you have to know who you are. You have to know who you are as a human being. You have to imagine who other people are as human beings, or you cannot be a fully educated person. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I am very grateful to be here and delighted to be here this afternoon. I've not been involved with the Yale New Haven Teacher Institutes, but as Paul mentioned, I was here once upon a time as a graduate student, and in the far more years than I care to think about since, I've been very involved with projects that connect me with K-12 education, including several that have been modeled on the Yale New Haven Teacher Institute. Many of you may have been familiar with the Teaching American History grants that the U.S. government, Department of Education, offered for a number of years from about 2000 to about 2012. At the time, I was in Nevada, and we had a series of those grants, and the institutes that we designed were very much modeled on this program. Modeled on this program in the sense that they created communities of teachers in sustained professional development opportunities, in some cases a semester long, in some cases a multi-week summer institute that led through research to lessons and units that we posted on the website. And this really, it really created a social studies community in northern Nevada. I don't know how many of you might be social studies or history teachers, but what we knew from the very beginning was that social studies teachers had been, as one of my colleagues put it, the least, the last, and the lost when it came to professional development, that opportunities went to other areas long before social studies, in part perhaps because there was less testing. And so there was a sense that, well, if we don't test it, does it really matter all that much? Very unfortunate. But what happened over time was that hundreds of teachers from across northern Nevada came together through these projects and ultimately formed a Northern Nevada Social Studies organization in order to foster this kind of work, which continues even after the Teaching American History grants. I lead with this because I think that a lot of the work that I've done over the years in that setting, also through the We the People, the Citizen of the Constitution program, and through teacher institutes at Mount Vernon, has been in the realm, and I'm going to pick up Brandon's word here, of context-based close analysis. That is, looking deeply at primary materials, primary sources in many genres and many media, always through a variety of contextual lenses to understand them better. And I think this kind of close analysis, I agree entirely with what everybody has said here. These kinds of techniques ultimately have deeper goals in mind. And I want to describe three of the deeper goals that I think matter a lot when I think about the kind of humanities education that students in all schools and students in high need schools certainly ought to have. The first is engendering an appreciation for complexity over simplification, especially in a society that is so fast-paced, in a society in which we can constantly click to the next story on our device of choice. And taking the time to slow down, analyze deeply, think about what we're looking at, juxtapose images closely is particularly important. The second is attending to historical and cultural specificity. At the same time, we try to consider the larger universal themes that have long been the province of the humanities, themes about truth and the nature of individuals and communities. At the same time, we think very specifically about particular groups or organizations. And the third general goal of the humanities that I think is really important is fostering empathy, an understanding of difference, and I want to draw a distinction, which I'll explain in a minute, between empathy and relatability. I think those are two different things, and I think both of them are important, but empathy often gets lost. Fostering an understanding of difference, historical or cultural, across time, place, or circumstances is something that the humanities enable us to do really well. For many years, I've taught Lorraine Hansberry's play A Raisin in the Sun to students of many different backgrounds. And when A Raisin in the Sun came out in 1959, Hansberry, although gratified by the acclaim for her work, was also disappointed by the nature of some of the praise. And the actor O.C. Davis, who played Walter Lee Younger in the play, described the disappointing response this way. He said, one of the biggest selling points about Raisin, filling the grapevine, writing the word of mouth, laying the foundation for its wide acceptance, was how much the Younger family was just like any other American family. Some people were ecstatic to find that, and quotes, it didn't really have to be about Negroes at all. It was rather a walking, talking, living demonstration of our mythic conviction that underneath all of us Americans, color ain't got nothing to do with it, are pretty much alike. People are just people, whoever they are, and all they want is a chance to be like other people. And I think what Davis is talking about, what Hansberry was disappointed about, was a desire on the part of people who see the play or read the play, and I think a desire on a lot of our students to think in terms of relatability. How are these people like me? How can I reshape what I'm reading through my own filters so that I can make it relevant. And I think relevance is important. At the same time, what that reading did, what that way of reading the play did, was wash out all the cultural specificity, all the things that make understanding African American experience in the 1950s and before particular, important, significant to understanding America. So when I teach this play, we think about everything from the history of redlining in urban neighborhoods to African Americans' responses to Africa over time and all kinds of other things in between. And the students themselves help to act out characters in order to try to inhabit them and then to analyze them from their own perspective. This, I think, is the key to empathy, really understanding the perspectives of others and trying, even though the connection to oneself might be what gets you in the door, the connection to oneself is also what you almost have to leave at the door at some point in order to deepen your own understanding of where someone else is coming from. And I think that, to me, is crucial for thinking about the humanities and what the humanities make it possible for us to do, to think about the experiences of others on their own terms, even as we come to, and maybe in a way, so that we come to understand ourselves even better. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I have the luxury of going last, so I've heard what everyone else has said, but I'm also conscious of the clock. So I took my assignment to be to talk about the goals for humanities education in high poverty, high minority public schools. And my answer stems from a premise, and the premise is that it is in our national interest to have more people go to college, particularly people who come from these high poverty, otherwise underrepresented aspects of our population, and that the study of the humanities does indeed contribute to the goals of these individuals and to us as a country. So what I want to do is make a few observations about the goals for humanities education for individual students, and then the goals for humanities education for institutions. For individuals, it works. That is, when students study the humanities, they do in fact gain the kinds of skills and perspectives that have just been talked about, and that those skills enable them to do better in school and prepares them for college better. This has been well documented through lots of studies. Second, these higher order cognitive skills and other perspectives also prepare people to do well once they're in college. And the correlation that has been done even by such muckrakers as Richard Aram in trying to describe the failings of American education, distinguish between those students who have studied the humanities and other students in their performance and success during college. Am I up to third now or fourth? Third. This is not news. This has always been true. About 30 years ago was the big fuss in the DC public schools when someone discovered that if you taught fourth graders Latin, their English language reading and writing skills would improve. We've known that. We've known a lot of things, and yet in American education we have to reinvent things as part of the latest trend. There are a lot of myths about what make the humanities compelling for students at the K-12 level and again at the college level. How many of you have seen the play Hamilton? Do you know about the play Hamilton? This is a hip-hop opera based on the life of Alexander Hamilton, now playing on Broadway, and it is very faithfully drawn from Ron Chernow's 800-page scholarly tome about Hamilton that appeared a few years ago. The Rockefeller Foundation recently gave over $1 million to fund 20,000 tickets for New York City school kids to see Hamilton. These are low-income inner-city kids from high-poverty schools. And if this works the way everyone thinks it will, the exposure to this dimension of American history through the language of hip-hop opera will do a lot to increase interest in American history and one hopes the rest of the humanities. You should see the play, it's great, just great. We know then, shifting to why it's in the interest of institutions to promote the humanities and cooperation at this level, is that there is a falling off of interest in the humanities. We've seen it in colleges and universities everywhere, even the most highly selective institutions, as well as those that are more market sensitive. To attract more students to the humanities, it requires seamless work between what goes on in the K-12 schools and what goes on during college. And these subjects are not thought of as sequential and cumulative as the sciences are, but they are. If you're a professor of French at Stanford University and you've seen enrollments in your French classes go down, you clearly have an interest in having French 101 taught well either to freshmen or to high school kids or to junior high school kids. And the same is true for every subject that would lend itself to a beginning, a middle, and an end, or a elementary and intermediate and advanced. And we need to encourage the kind of cooperation that will build that support. There are a lot of myths about the humanities, and one of them is that if you major in the humanities, you won't get a job after college. It turns out this is false. Anthony Carnevale at Georgetown University has studied tens of thousands of college graduates, and it is now absolutely the case that people who major in the humanities do just as well as people who major in other fields, if not 1 year after college, then certainly 5 years after college or 10 years after college. And fields differ. Different majors have different trajectories in terms of income. At CIC, we are just winding down a 3-year public information campaign on the liberal arts more generally, which of course includes the humanities. And we've collected hundreds of testimonials from graduates of colleges. And the theme of these testimonials shows just how transformative the study of the humanities can be. I came to College X thinking I wanted to major in communications. I thought I wanted to work in the advertising industry. I happened to take this music course because my roommate said it was a great course. I fell in love with music. I ended up majoring in music. That got me a summer job with a record company, and now I'm a business executive working in Hollywood. You know, these transformations of personal and professional plans that are made possible by this study of the humanities is, I think, we do have to encourage actively at all levels. One challenge is getting college and university faculty to recognize the connection between their work and what goes on in the schools. And if we can't use any other high-minded arguments, I hope we can use the arguments of self-interest. That if you want students to come and study the humanities, you've got to help prepare those students and get them interested in the humanities. I think it's also the case that, as was very well demonstrated in the discussions of the Delaware and Philadelphia Institutes this morning, the intellectual excitement engendered by the cooperative spirit of the Institute approach is something that lends itself to broad bases of cooperation. And indeed, on a citywide basis, this is one of the few kinds of activity where colleges and universities aren't competing. They can actually cooperate and align their interests in working with the school systems in the area to encourage students to come along and study these subjects. So, for a variety of reasons, I think we've got a lot to gain by focusing on the question of what are the goals for humanities education at both the student levels, starting in the pre-college levels and going into college, and also at the institutional level, and see if we can make a greater stance in favor of these goals as part of a unified effort that is very much in societal interest overall. In the interest of time, Paul, I will stop. Thank you.
I think that this occasion might best be served by inviting rapid-fire staccato comments from the audience. I'm not sure we've said anything that would engender too many questions in any case, but if any of us are moved to return to the lectern, remember that's what we have to do. We can't speak from our seats. So, please.
I was, of course, intrigued with a lot of the things that different people said, but I was drawn to Mary's comment about, I got this right, walking the area and asking questions of the neighborhood, like why is my city organized this way? Why are things the way they are? And what decisions have been made? Because I just tell my students all the time that it's almost more important to have a good question than an answer. And to keep leading those questions towards deeper and richer inquiry. And, they want to say, okay, so what is the answer? And tell me what it is. And if I tell them, then we're done. But questions lead to more. And I think that's the most interesting part.
Thanks, Sidney. EM, back in the back.
Generally very soft-spoken. Thank you all for your comments. I think that right now I'm equally terrified and excited about the humanities. And that is to say that I'm terrified because when I read about governors in states saying, oh, we would like to charge students more money to study the humanities than something useful, I get terrified. But then I get excited because in my new role at my school, I work in part with students who are applying to college. And yesterday I had the pleasure of working with a young woman to send her application to Northwestern, and she's really excited, and she wants to study medicine, and she said, but, Miller, you gotta understand, I also really love music, and I'm not gonna give that up. So there's your STEAM plug, and I think that as long as we have students like her, students who continue to value the humanities and the arts, then we'll be okay. And we can tune out perhaps some of that other negative energy.
Thanks, yeah. Others? I'd love to hear from some university representatives who are here about their own perspective on preparation for college, for example, as something that the humanities can improve.
I'm commenting simply because you're asked for a comment from a university representative. Bob Gervaisi from Quincy University. The biggest challenge that I see is that we are kind of in a post-literate culture where text no longer means the 400-page epic of Homer. It means a 140-character tweet. And the humanities traditionally has been built on an appreciation of texts in the larger and richer sense. And that requires a commitment to focus and expanded attention that our current cultural preoccupation with multitasking tends to militate against. So I would think that one of the ways that colleges and schools can collaborate is to encourage in students a love of text, as well as a love of the visual and performed and audible word. And I wondered if there might be some way to assemble some kind of task force to brainstorm ways to recover in a positive way the importance of texts as a gateway to the study of the humanities.
Let me propose the 24 books of the Iliad, one tweet at a time.
This gentleman in front.
Ray Keck from Laredo, Texas. I think one of the problems, I agree with everything you just said, of course, we know that, and thank you all for your comments. I made notes and all sorts of things I want to go back and do and say better. Empathy, relatability, that's a wonderful dichotomy and we ought to, it's not a dichotomy, it's two different ways of being, and one leads to issues that I hadn't realized before. I think one of the problems that we all face with texts is that it's slow going. In recent times, I've been team teaching courses with people in the humanities, And it's very possible to take a dialogue of Plato's, or to take a play of Shakespeare's, or to take a short story of F. Scott Fitzgerald and go very slowly through it, and students get dazzled. It's beautiful. You don't have to explain to them that it's beautiful if you can read it out loud together and talk about it as you go, but that is slow going. It is very hard. And our courses are supposed to be quick, and we're supposed to have outcome measures, and we're supposed to have means of assessment, and we're supposed to show it all and keep a record of how we're doing it. Very, very difficult. Several years ago, I was reading a 19th century novel, Spanish novel, with a group of students. I think it's a magnificent novel. They were actually graduate students. They hated it. It's a huge novel. So at the end of the class, I said, well, read the first 200 pages for next week. It was very, very dense. I was going to give it 3 weeks. And they came back and hated it. These were students that loved me, hated the novel, thought it was terrible. Why would you make us do this thing? We've read all these wonderful, exciting, vibrant books, and suddenly you've thrown this horrible thing at us. Okay. We're going to read the first chapter out loud. We have 3 hours tonight. We're going to read the first chapter out loud. At the end of 3 hours, when we finish and go home, if you don't like it, I will join you. We'll throw it out the window. Well, we sat there and read the first chapter out loud, and we got to the end. They and I, and you all know this, freshly, as if I'd never read it before, thought, this may be the most wonderful thing I've ever read in my entire life. We ended up spending 4 weeks on the novel, 850 pages, and rather dense. And I still run it. That was 20 years ago. I still run across students regularly who tell me that night that we slowly together read that first chapter is when I learned how beautiful writing could be. But can't be done quickly.
I think, oh boy, now we have hands. One more comment. Let's see how that goes, and then we have our breakout sessions to get to.
Kind of opposed to that, I think there's another part of that we need to embrace, that the culture of our students as humanities too, and sort of like making sure that we're listening before we're talking. I think there's a lot of ways that they say really beautiful things in a tweet, and they have mastered the art of kind of rhetoric in their own way, and I think that we need to honor that as humanities instead of telling them what humanities are. So I think there's kind of it needs to go both ways, because I don't think they'll go through the open door of Plato until they really feel like their own lives are kind of recognized. So.
Thanks, Molly. We have one more.
Hi, I'm Shannon Foster Williams. I'm an art teacher from Richmond, Virginia, and I teach history and English and even math through art. And I have found that by teaching my children to focus on and concentrate and look at things and discuss them and to discover, using the humanities has enriched their learning of history and of English. I do something called blind readings, where we'll take a piece of poetry and the children have to sit quietly with their eyes closed and imagine everything going on in that poem or in that story. They illustrate it, they draw pictures of it, and then they have to write about it. And I'm amazed by how just listening and focusing and concentrating on mental pictures or the images in their head, how they're able to write things that mirror what they've drawn, and they're so specific and detailed. So the arts, humanities play a large role in enriching what students learn, and they're very effective, and I think education would be sad without them.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all for your patience. I've enjoyed this event a great deal, and now we proceed to our various tasks. You know, they're multiple depending who we are. I'm going to a breakout session. Others probably not. In any case, thanks a lot and good afternoon.